Hi all, welcome to Cyber Warfare Lab's AWS Cloud Red Team course. In this module, we will discuss about how we can misuse the Lambda functions to perform our privilege escalations. So you can see here in this diagram, suppose there is one user. This user have least permissions or privileges. You can see here there is two privileges. One is this user can pass the role, and second one is this user can create a Lambda functions. So if this user have these two permissions, this user can perform the privilege escalations in AWS environments. So you can see here pass the roles and attach roles, attach role policy. There is two different things. In the pass the role, we can pass the role while creating a function, so while creating a EC2 instance, but attach role can be applied when you have existing functions. You can attach the roles to existing functions. So this is the difference between pass the role and attach role policies. So you can see we have a Lambda functions, and this users have the permissions on Lambda function, that this user can create the function as well as this user can pass the role to these functions. Other hand, we know that there is already Lambda function is there, role. Lambda function role is already there in AWS account, and this is the all policy. This is a policy which this role contains. In this policy, the role mentioned that the policy mentioned that this function or this role can attach a policy to any role. So basically, you can understand about we have a user which we compromise. This is a user that we already compromised. We have access to this user, which is a least user, because this user have only two permission. One is this user can pass the role as well as this user can create the functions. While creating the function, this user can pass the role, but which role they can pass? Role which should be or exist there in AWS account. So suppose this is the role which is already exist, and this role have this policy attached to this role. The policy say this role can attach the policy to any other role or the same on the same one also. So this is how, if you have a two scenario, if you have two conditions, you can perform the privilege escalation. Let's see how it's work. So suppose initially what it does, this user can create a new Lambda function and attach this role to this Lambda function, because this user have a create function permission as well as pass role permissions. So this user can attach this role to this Lambda function. Now this Lambda functions have the same policy which is attached to this role. That means this Lambda functions can attach role policy to any other role or to any roles basically. Now while creating the function, suppose if we mention that in the code, that the code should look like, so this is a function that we created. If we attach the role to the same role, and this is the policy which we are going to attach, so this is the role we are going to attach this policy, because this function have attach role policy permission, which is now part of this Lambda function. That means this Lambda functions can attach himself as a administrator policies. So once he become the administrator, once this function or once this role become the administrator, when your Lambda function have administrator permissions, this can do, or this Lambda function can do whatever thing they have. So this Lambda function again can attach the administrator policy to this user permissions, and then we can use this permissions or administrator policy to access the AWS services. So we will get to know more about when we're doing the practically. So let's see how it's work. So suppose we have a user. Let's enumerate information about the users. So suppose I already compromised one account, and this is the identity of this user. So this is the, so I configured there in this profile, and this is the username admin database. So basically this is a user which have these two permissions, pass role as well as create function permissions. Let's see what permission is basically attached to this particular user. Just copy this one. This command basically listed down all the managed policy which is there in this particular, which is attached to this particular user. There may be a chance that there may be inline policy, so you can also look at the inline policy which is embedded in there in this user for your red team operations. So let's open a new tab. You have to specify the username, so I'm having this username here, copy it and paste it here. So you can see there is a one IAM read only access. That means all the operation that we are going list at a permission, list policy, get policy. That means this user have a IAM read only access. So this is useless. Basically this is only useful for enumeration phase. But there is one more policy which is attached to here is Lambda permission management policy. Let's see what are the permission there in this policy. So now we can use this command to retrieve the policy as well as the permission which is there in this particular policy. So let's copy this one, open a new tab. Okay, now what thing we need to do, we have to specify the ARN of the particular policy. So this is a policy which is attached to this user. Let's see what permission does it contain. I copy this ARN, and you can also specify the version name. So let's see, I specify version 1. If there are any updation, you can also specify version 2, version 3. So you can see this is the default version, this is the version 1, and this is the default version. That means this is the huge in currently this version is in used, and these are the permissions: get role as well as pass role and all other permission on Lambda. That means this can invoke the function, this can create the functions, but what we are going to basically looking for, we are looking for the create functions. So this user have a administrator on Lambda function. This user can manage the Lambda function. But apart from this one, how we can escalate the privilege to access the S3 or any other services, or how I can become a AWS account administrator. Currently I have these 3 roles, basically roles on Lambda function as well as get role and pass role permissions. So pass role and this Lambda function, that means create a function permissions, is really helpful to doing all these things. So this is all about the information that I can get about this user. So this user have these two basically 2 important permission. Apart from them, there is a other permission which is useless, basically, which is used for listed down or doing the enumeration phase. Now what next we can do? What next we can do? We know that we have a create function as well as pass role permissions. If we have these 2 permissions, we can create a new Lambda function and we can pass the role, or we can attach the role which is already exist there to this particular Lambda function. So let's see how many roles are there. Let's look out all the roles which is there, which is basically related to Lambda functions. So what we are going to enumerate, we are going to enumerate all the roles in this particular Lambda functions, or in particular AWS account. We are only interested in Lambda function role because this is the role which is basically, this is also a Lambda function role. This is for SSM. You can also enumerate what permission this the role contains for your. This is for EC2 instance role. This is again for SSM role. We are looking for Lambda function role. So let's see down. This is for RDS. Because a Lambda function, to a Lambda function we can only attach a Lambda function role. This is EC2, this is again EC2, this is EC2, this is a user, this is a ECS, this is a Lambda function role. You can see there is a Lambda permission management role. So seems like this is a custom role they created, and this is the role. What permission does this role contain? So let's see what permission does this role have. Open a new tab. What are the permission or what are the policy which is attached to this role? Same like we did for users. Let's see what permission this role have. Copy this one. You have to specify the role name. Then I also specify the profile. Profile. What is the profile name I use in database? Because this is the profile. This is the user I configured, and you have to specify the role name here. So I copy the role name from here because it seems like interesting. So you can attach any available role in this particular AWS account, but this should be a Lambda role. So seems like because this service, you can see this is a Lambda role. This can assume this Lambda can assume this role. Let's see what are the permission, what are the policy there in this role. No, not this one. Let's copy this one, paste it here. Okay, let's profile admin database. Okay, the profile name is different. Profile is database admin. This is the username, so I have to specify. Specify this one. So you can see here this particular role, Lambda permission management role, this is the policy which is attached. The policy name is attach role policy, and this ARN of this policy. Let's see what permission does this role contain. So when you're going for enumeration the permissions, you can copy this one. Similar like we did for users, we are going to do with the role, because role is also important in this case. If role have a higher privilege, we can attach this role and we can do whatever operation that we want to do as a higher privileged. So this is the version ID. I specify the v1. There may be other version ID as well, so you can check what is the default version ID. Now we have to specify the ARN of this policy which is attached to this role. And you can see this role have these two permission. List role, which is basically read only permission. This is useless, not much important. This is the second one, attach role policy. This is really important. That means this role can attach any policy to any role. You understood? So basically how it works, this function role, basically this is the Lambda function role which have this attach role policy. That means if I attach this role to this Lambda function, if I mention the code that you have to attach the particular policy to the particular role, you can attach it. But it's only can attach the policy to a role, not a user, not a group, but can only attach a policy which is already there in your environment. You can attach this policy to any role. This is the key factor. So you need, if you have a two thing, you have at least pass role as well as attach role policy. You can misuse, you can make a combination and you can misuse it. So let's see how we can misuse it. So you can see I created this file, basically code for Lambda functions. And in Lambda function, I mentioned that first what we are going to do, because we have a role attach policy, first we have to attach the same role. This is the same role. You can see this is the role which we are looking for. This is the role which we are looking for. Lambda, this is the role name, Lambda function permission role. We are going to attach this administrator policy to this role, because we can attach any policy to ourselves or any other role. So first we are going to attach ourselves, and then what next we are going to do, once we become the administrator, we can do whatever thing we have to do, and we can do, and we are going to attach these users to administrator policy again, because initially we can't do this thing because we can only attach the policy to the role. So once we attach the administrator policy to this role, we become the administrator, and we can attach the Lambda become the administrator. Now if Lambda become the administrator, we can attach this policy to the this user. Now your user become the administrator. So this is the code. I just copy this code, create a zip file of this code, because this is the code we are going to upload. This is the code we are using to create a functions. So let's add to archive. So this is the code. The name of this function is Lambda function. File name is Lambda function. And what is handler there? So handler is Lambda handler. So now we are going to create a Lambda function. So we explore about the user, this information. We explore the role information. Now next, what we are going to do. So this is the first step we are going to do. Create a Lambda function with privilege escalation code. So this is a privilege escalation code, and with attach role. So this is the role we have, and we are creating this function. So this is a command which used to create a functions and attach a role. So you can see here, the create function command is used to create a function. Here you have to specify the function name, runtime, whatever programming language you can use. Zip file, this is the code. You can specify the code. This is the handler. Role which you are going to pass, because this user have a pass role permissions. So whatever role you can define here, you can define the ARN, and you also define the region, in which region you have to create this Lambda function. So let's copy this one. Let's copy this one. First let's go to the desktop. Now paste it here. Region you have to specify US East. You can specify whatever region you want. Profile, you can choose this profile, otherwise it will take the other user credentials. So I choose this profile because this user have both the permission, pass the role permission as well as create function permissions. Now role ARN. So role, you can see here, this is the role which contain this list or attach role policy. So this is the role of ARN which we are going to enumerate. You can also see here, this is the same one. This is the role name and this is the ARN of this one. So this is a policy. We have to specify the role ARN. Yes. So you can see here, this is the role which is already exist. We are going to attach this role to Lambda functions. So I just copy this ARN. Now what next? Let's function name. Let's red thing. This is the function name. You have to specify the zip file name. So zip file name will be this one, Lambda functions. Lambda functions. It's underscore or dash Lambda function. It's underscore or this. It's underscore dot zip. Handler name. So handler name, how it's look like. So handler name will be your file name. So file name is Lambda function. As well as your handler. So handler, you can see this is the handler, Lambda handler. This is the file name, Lambda function, and this is the handler. So this is how it becomes this one. Let's copy this one. and paste it here. So this is how we can create the function. What thing we are going to specify? We are using this create function command. This is a function name, runtime, the code, which is this one, and this contain the malicious thing. Basically, because if you have attached role policy, we are going to attach the administrator access to this role, the role itself. So once it's become the administrator, this can do whatever operation they want to do. So we can use the same function. We have to invoke the same function again, and this will attach the administrator access policy to the admin database user. Then you have to specify the handler, the role, and the region where you want to, in which region you want to create this function, as well as profile, which either credential do you use. I use this database admin credentials. So you can specify, you can see I will create a function. So let's call this function. Let's create this function first. You can see here last update status successful. So I'm successfully able to create a functions. Now what next? So you can see here from this step, what next we can do. First we have to create this function. We created this function, we added the malicious code. So we create the function, we added the malicious code and attach this role to this Lambda functions. Second thing, we have to invoke this function. So there is a multiple way to invoke it, synchronous, asynchronous, or event. So you have to check what role or what rights your user have to invoke this thing. So in this current scenario, suppose we have an administrator access on Lambda functions. Administrator access on Lambda function, that means we can the users which we compromise have only access on Lambda function, but they can do all this thing in Lambda function. So they can also invoke using CLI to this Lambda function. But if you don't have, you have to find out a multiple way or other way to invoke this function. Because once you invoke, the code which you mentioned there will be executed. Otherwise it will be there itself. The second thing we are going to do, trigger a newly created Lambda function using the CLI or API. So let's see what we are going to do. We are going to invoke this thing, and this is the command which we use to invoke these functions. So just copy this command, open a new tab, paste it here. Region, you have to specify in which region this function is there. So you have to specify east to use to US east to right, and profile just copy this. There should be this user should have rights to invoke this function, but our case, because this user have a all the permission in Lambda functions. Function name you have to specify red team. I think I created the function with name of red team. Yes, so this is the function name, this is the ARN of the function, the code, all this thing you can see here. This is a role which is attached to this function. And we already know this is a policy, and this is the policy, and these are the permission which is there in this role. So let's try to invoke. This is the response notation where the response will be stored here. Let's invoke this function. You can see I got this function error, and this is say unhandled. When I look for the JSON response.json, I see this one, access denied when calling attach user policy operations. It is happen, why? Because when you see the source code, when you're looking for the source code, we specified two things. One is attach role policy, and second one is attach user policy. This function or the role which have only attach role policy but doesn't have this permissions. So second permission doesn't have the second permissions. It doesn't have the user policy permission. That's why we got this error. We got not the role policy error, we got the user policy operation error. And this is a really important, and it will be, it's by default should be there. You can see this role cannot not authorized to perform these actions. Why it's happened? Because currently this role doesn't have to attach the policy to a user, because it's only have attach the policy to a role. Let's see what policy is attached to this role, because you can see there is no error for this attaching the policy to a role. That means this administrator policy should be attached to this role. Now if you invoke again, it's become the administrator now. So it's become administrator policies should be attached now. Let's open the same one. Let's see what is permission now, or what is the policy currently attached to this role. So let's copy this one. Let's open a new one. You have to specify the role name. So role we have, what is the role name we have? This is the role name we have. Same role name we use. Let's see. Now when your first code is executed, initially you can see we have only this permissions, but now there is administrator policies attached, because once as soon as we invoke this function, our first code is executed, because we have because this role have this attached role policy, and we got the error in second code. But if you invoke again, now this role also have the administrator access. So administrator can do all these things. So when you looking for this one, you can see there is a two policy attached now. When we did first time, you can see there is only one policy attached to this one. But when we look for the initial, this is the only policy which is attached to this role. You can see the same role. But when we're looking now, there is two policy attached to this one. So this is how you can understand that this role also added these new policies. Because of this role have this permission, attach role policy permissions, and the code which is mentioned there in the Lambda functions have this. That means you can attach this administrator access policy to this function. So this is how it attach. Now this Lambda function have administrator access. We don't have, this user doesn't have administrator access. How this user can get the administrator access? So if you invoke again, that means this second function is also be executed, because administrator can do whatever thing they have to do. So let's invoke again. Let's invoke again this one. And you can see there is no exception handle we got, because then second case administrator policy attached to this one. So that means it can execute it whatever mentioned there in your code. Now let's see what permission is attached to the user. So let's copy this one, and you have to specify the username, paste it here. So I use the profile, so I just copy it from first. That's the first thing that we got. Yeah, username is database user, and profile name is this one. So initially we found that there is two policy. One is read-only access policy, and second one is Lambda permission policy attached to this one. But after invoking this thing, after performing privilege escalation, let's see how many policies are attached to this one. And you can see here administrator access policy is also attached to this one. So this is how you become the administrator on AWS account, via misusing the Lambda functions and the permission which is there in the users, as well as permission which is there in the role which is there in Lambda function. So this is how you can use the combination of all these things to perform your privilege escalation. Now you can do whatever action you want to do because you are the administrator there in AWS account. So I think you have the good understanding about, now you have the understanding about how we did it. So let's, one more time, let's recall it. So what we did, suppose initially we have a user have a two permission. One is pass role permission and second one is create function permissions. So pass role permission, basically what it does, it will only applicable when you are creating a function you can pass the role. So that means you have to check the roles. You have to check the role which is related to Lambda function. So you found there is a role. Role also have this policy, attach role policy. If your role also have this policy, that means this role can attach a policy or whatever policy to any other role or any role which is there in AWS. So what we are going to do, first we create a functions. Okay, so suppose we created a functions. This is the function. We attach this role to this function. That means this function also have a rights to attach the policy. In the code, what we did in the code, we did that first you have to attach the administrator policy to this role itself. So now this role also have this new administrator policy. So by invoking the first time, so this is when we invoking the first time, this is the operation is done. Now when we invoke the second time, because in code we have a two things, attach the administrator policy to admin policy to attach admission policy to role, and in second thing attach, when we invoke second time, it's attach administrator policy to this user. Because first time it gave the error, why? Because this role doesn't have attach user policy, it's only have attach role policy. But after once you attach the administrator policy to this role itself, administrator, then now this role have administrator access. That means this role can do whatever permission they want to do. So once you executed the second times, this function have the administrator access. This function attach the new administrator policy to this user. Now this user can become the administrator. This is the new permissions. The initial two permission is already there, and second we got the administrator permissions. Now this user can access whatever services they want to access with administrator access. So this is how, using a least privilege, using these two permissions, so basically these three permission is really important, 1, 2 and this one. So if you have these permissions, you can become the AWS account administrator. So this is how you can escalate your privilege. So this is all about this video. There is multiple way you can do these things, but this is a simple way we can escalate our privilege using or by misusing the AWS services. So this is all about this video. Thank you so much.